and then I will actually give a bit of a 301 on everything you might want to know about alternative proteins. So what they are, what the commercial landscape looks like, what the underlying sensor technology actually is, and then finally, how you might be able to get involved in this very exciting space. So GFI is an international non-profit organization. We essentially exist to try and build a more sustainable, secure, and just food system by transforming the way that we produce meat and eggs and dairy. The way in which we do that is through 3 programmatic areas, so science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy. Essentially, we are working with scientists, businesses, and policymakers to try and accelerate the rate at which we move towards a world where alternative proteins are no longer alternative. I work in the Good Food Institute Europe. GFI Europe is part of a network of kind of Good Food Institute affiliates. So we also have teams in the US, in Brazil, Israel, India, and Asia Pacific. So moving on to the why, this was touched on a bit already. Global meat production and consumption is essentially inextricably linked with a bunch of big harms. Those can be environmental. So if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, so the 14.5% figure has actually been updated more recently as part of the IPCC, but essentially whatever you care about when it comes to the environment, whether it's climate change, whether it's environmental degradation, whether it's deforestation, animal agriculture is the leading driver or one of the leading drivers of those issues. It's not just about environmental degradation. If you care about animal welfare, if you care about public health, if you care about food security, again, animal agriculture, intensive animal agriculture is one of the leading drivers, or depending on the specific factor, the leading driver of these problems. Within public health, if you look at things like zoonotic diseases, the vast majority of pandemics are animal-derived in origin. You literally couldn't invent a more efficient way of transferring new pandemics to human populations than crowding lots of animals together in tiny spaces and having them then interact with humans as part of that. The vast majority of antibiotics that we develop are being fed to farmed animals. I remember when I was at school, I was told that the real problem with antimicrobial resistance was that people aren't finishing their course of antibiotics. That is not the major driver of antimicrobial resistance. Something like 80% globally of our antibiotics are going to factory farmed animals in a preventative, indiscriminate way. We're not treating infections with them, we're feeding them to the animals such that we can get away with keeping them in the conditions that we are keeping them in. Obviously, if you believe that animals can suffer, there is obviously a major welfare issue associated with these intensive conditions as well. So that's what we're dealing with. Then if you look at what the projected meat production and consumption look like, it just looks to track up and up and up over the coming decades. So essentially, we know that there are these harms. We know that we're literally running out of land and that we're kind of destroying our planet in the process. But at the same time, meat consumption is just continuing to rise. If you kind of try to think about why that might be, it seems that meat consumption just tracks in a linear way with increasing wealth globally. So if we look at where we are now to the year 2050, that future consumption isn't actually in places like the UK. The UK is actually reducing its meat consumption. It's places like Brazil, China, Nigeria, India. It's the places where we have this big growing population, a rising middle class, and people are just consuming far more meat per capita than they ever did before. Why is that? Why is it we know that this is a problem, and yet people, essentially, it's not actually influencing people's behavior. People aren't reducing their meat consumption, and they haven't done for the last 50 years that we've known that these issues exist. It essentially seems to be that people just love eating meat. I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. Many of you may be those people. I am a vegetarian, but I certainly enjoyed eating meat, and I didn't enjoy giving it up. I liked meat. It just seems to be that people want to consume meat products. And so the very small fraction of the population who is happy eating the existing alternatives that are out there, those are the existing vegetarians and vegans. Those are not the target audience here. That's kind of not the problem. The target audience is people who are continuing to consume animal products because they want to. And it is this bracket of consumers for whom they basically aren't happy with this. This is not a meaningful alternative which is actually going to displace their meat consumption. These people basically want to consume things which are familiar to them, are tasty to them, are convenient to them. So that seems to be part of the kind of theory here as to why meat consumption just doesn't seem to change. And that really just leads us to our solution or theory of change at the Good Food Institute. We essentially believe that telling people what to do and asking them to reduce their meat consumption just isn't going to get you anywhere. And actually, you kind of have to take this market-driven approach by giving people the same thing that they want to eat, but producing those things in just a far more sustainable way. And so that is what we mean by alternative proteins, giving people the same meat, egg, and dairy products, but just producing them not from animals, but from plants or microorganisms or culturing cells. We'll go into the different actual underlying technologies in a moment. Okay, so by a moment, I mean, we're going to go into it now. At the Good Food Institute, we break down alternative proteins into these three verticals. In reality, it's not quite as clean cut as this, and there are multiple ways in which technologies or ingredients produced from one vertical might be utilized in a product using ingredients from a different vertical, but this is possibly the most kind of simple and helpful way to think about the kind of landscape of alternative proteins. On the left-hand side, we have plant-based alternative proteins. So 99% of the products on the market, if you have eaten a meat alternative, it's probably plant-derived in origin. So you are taking plants, breaking them down into their constituent components, and then reformulating them into products which are trying to kind of look and cook and taste the same way as animal products. I'm going to do cultivated next, and then I'll go to fermentation. Cultivated is the newest of the alternative protein platforms. As a technology, it's only really kicked off over the last decade or so. Essentially, you are growing real animal cells without an animal. So if you think of a metaphor of you take cuttings from a plant and then you grow that in a greenhouse. This is kind of like that. You're taking a small sample of cells from an animal, growing them up in a bioreactor or a cultivator, providing those cells with all of the things which they would otherwise receive within an animal, and then harvesting them and producing genuinely real meat products out of them. So you're recapitulating the same kind of 3D tissue structure, the same components, it's animal fat, it's animal muscle protein within that final product. Fermentation is probably the blurriest category for alternative proteins. The simplest way of describing it is essentially taking microorganisms and using them in weird and wonderful ways to produce either meat alternatives directly or specific ingredients that might make it easier to produce plant-based or cultivated meat products. So to give a very specific example, the UK is the home of corn, so Q-U-O-R-N. That actually isn't a plant, it's a mycelium, so it's a type of fungus, like a mushroom. And that's what we call biomass fermentation, where the microorganism is the actual alternative protein product that you're trying to produce. I really like this slide. It essentially is trying to make the point that alternative proteins are not really doing anything new here, even though they might sound kind of radical and wild and like we're really kind of diverting the kind of path of human evolution. There's actually just a bunch of different examples where humanity used to use animals because they were the only things we had available. And then we used technology to displace them and just solve that problem in much easier and better and more efficient ways. So I won't go through all of these examples, but let's say, for example, food storage and tradable wealth. We used to use livestock essentially as a way to transfer wealth or money between people. And then we invented currency, and no longer were we needing to use livestock to do that. Another example, transportation. Previously, animals were the mode by which we traveled around the world, horses and pack animals. And then through technology, we invented cars and planes and trains. So this was just more efficient, and it reduced the need to use animals to actually do that. So alternative proteins, you can kind of conceptually see them as continuing this trend of taking the animal out of a process where we always use them kind of because it was there, because it was obvious, but actually we just can do better, essentially. Okay, so this graph only tracks venture capital, So this isn't total investment going into the alternative protein space, but venture capital is the kind of funding which funds startups. And this is essentially for all three pillars, so plant-based, fermentation, and cultivated, the amount of VC capital going into the space over the last decade or so. As you can see, it's been looking pretty positive. Things have been going up pretty quickly. And for any year in turn, the amount of investment going into the space is about the same as all of the years prior combined. So it's like not quite exponential, but it's somewhat exponential, the rate at which money has been flowing into the space. That's really cool. That's really exciting. I think it gives a lot of reason for optimism insofar as the products available in the market right now clearly are not quite there yet on taste or price parity. And yet, with that being true, there is still confidence amongst investors and the commercial space to actually move into this and try and scale this sector up. So that's just a nice thing to see. That being said, and this uses the 14.5% figure for greenhouse gas emissions. That being said, even if you look at the rate of change in the sector itself, it looks very positive and like it's going up. But if you actually compare that total amount of funding to any other space, especially if you think about the problems that you're trying to solve, like climate change or potential future pandemics, alternative proteins are actually woefully underfunded compared to the other solutions out there. So this slide essentially shows that animal agriculture and transportation are somewhat equivalent in terms of the total amount that they contribute towards climate change. And yet, if you look at the amount of funding that's going into alternative proteins versus just one of the alternatives for kind of non-renewable based transportation, you're seeing about an order of magnitude less funding going in than we're seeing for transportation. So this is just to make the point that, yes, alternative proteins is booming as a sector. That doesn't mean that it's at all saturated and that it could not absorb so much more funding given to the scale of the challenges that the sector is actually trying to solve. Let's talk a little bit about the science and technology. Before I do, I might just ask for a show of hands for people with a sciencey background. So I can, okay, so like mostly, but not all. Cool. I don't know if any of you had tried an alternative protein product before about 10 years ago, but they were appalling. And it is kind of amazing if you look at the space right now, and you know, every day you can see this if you go to the supermarket and go and look at what different alternative protein products are available. The space has come on in leaps and bounds in terms of how close these products are to actual taste parity with animal products and how much the costs have come down. They are not yet at price parity, but costs have come down significantly. So basically, a lot of progress has actually already been achieved. That being said, for a scientific research field which didn't really exist more than 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's not surprising that there's a huge amount of kind of conceptual white space that can still be kind of looked at in order to make much more progress on this. If you start working on a problem, in the early days of working on that problem, you can make a lot of progress with little effort because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. It's relatively untapped as a problem. And alternative proteins is very much at this kind of tipping point moment where people coming to work in this space are able to do really amazing things quite quickly just because it's such a new space. So I might actually upload the results a little bit. So with that in mind, let's look a little bit at what those actual research challenges are for those three production pillars. So I gave a brief overview before, but just to go into a little bit more detail, if we start with plant-based, let's just briefly look at how these products are being made right now. So as I mentioned, you're essentially taking crops. At the moment, the vast majority of crops used for plant-based meat are soy and wheat and pea. There's not really a good reason for that beyond the fact that those are the crops which are currently being grown at scale globally, and so there are well-established supply chains. But these crops were not developed for plant-based meat, they've not been optimized for plant-based meat. There's no reason why plant-based meat should be using those crops as the inputs. You're taking those crops, you're extracting the kind of raw ingredients out of them and then optimizing those raw ingredients, processing them, and then eventually doing what's called texturization. So for those of you who kind of are on the sciencey side, in general, the proteins that you find in plants are globular, whereas the proteins that you find in animals tend to be fibrillar. And that's quite important for texture when you're actually eating animal tissue. So with this texturization process, you're essentially trying to take plant-based ingredients, plant-based proteins, and process them in such a way that you're able to recapitulate that kind of 3D texture, the kind of fibrillar strands that you find in animal tissue. At the moment, the vast majority of products on the market are using something called extrusion, which was not developed for alternative proteins. It was developed for a bunch of different other sectors. In the food space, I think it's mostly been applied to make things like Cocoa Pops. So again, this was not developed for the sector. There's obviously a huge amount of work that could be done to actually improve the way in which we're texturizing these proteins. This is a summary of some of the most kind of useful or kind of leveraged research priorities for plant-based meat. I spoke a little bit about raw materials, but again, we don't need to be using soy or wheat. There's no reason why not to necessarily, but there's definitely work that can be done to understand what, for example, native crops could be grown in the UK, which would be good raw ingredients for developing plant-based meat. Better ways to extract those proteins and the other macronutrients out of those crops, so it's just more efficient and less energy intensive. Texturization, I mentioned. Fat is an interesting one. The long and short of it is that meat tastes good because of fat. So that's a little bit of a simplification, but it's basically the case. And animal fats are chemically quite different from plant fats. So finding plant-derived fat sources which can behave and function in a similar way to animal fats in plant-based meat is really tricky. You'll have seen that the vast majority of products on the market right now are using less unsaturated fats, so things like palm oil or coconut oil. These are not particularly sustainable, and they basically don't function very well in the products. Animal fat is encapsulated, so when you fry a burger or you fry a steak, the fat doesn't kind of burst out and dribble out into the pan. It kind of stays, and then you put it in your mouth, and then it bursts in your mouth. Whereas when you cook a plant-based burger, they tend to be a bit greasy, and the fat tends to leach out into the pan. So that's one major research area, which would be really cool if people could work on that, because it's definitely something holding back the products from taste parity as well as nutritional parity. So that's plant-based. If we look at fermentation, I mentioned fermentation is the biggest or the kind of blurriest category. We break it down into 3 types of fermentation, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So the first of these is traditional fermentation. Traditional fermentation is what human beings have been doing for literally thousands of years when they've been producing things like bread or wine or tempeh or sauerkraut. Traditional fermentation is using microorganisms to transform a generally plant-derived a kind of plant feedstock that you're providing to them, and they'll metabolize it and produce new and interesting compounds, things that might give it a really meaty taste, that kind of umami taste. So there's a few companies working on this right now using traditional fermentation to produce alternative proteins. Biomass fermentation, I briefly mentioned earlier in the context of corn. That is where the thing you're eating is the microorganism itself. So you're essentially leveraging the fact that microorganisms, filamentous fungi, can grow incredibly quickly and efficiently and produce really high quality, complete protein with relatively minimal resources. To kind of ground that in some data, the company Enough, which actually isn't on this slide, there's another one of these biomass fermentation companies. They're building a plant right now in the Netherlands, which could produce apparently a cow's worth of protein every 2 minutes. So it's pretty wild how efficient this can be if you're growing microorganisms and building an effective bioprocess to actually do that. And then finally, precision fermentation. For the kind of biochemists or industrial biotechnologists amongst you, this is basically just recombinant protein production. This is using microorganisms as essentially miniature cell factories to produce very specific proteins or ingredients. So for example, in yeast, you could produce egg white proteins, milk proteins, collagen, heme, growth factors. So you can produce the real animal thing without the animal again. It's not new. The vast majority of the world's insulin is produced via this process. It's familiar to the food industry. The vast majority of the world's food, cheese, is produced using rennet, which used to be extracted from calves' stomachs, but we've been producing it recombinantly for decades. So it's not a new technology. It's new being applied to alternative proteins to produce specific animal-like or bioidentical to animal ingredients. There's a lot of potential with fermentation. So I mentioned it's a mature technology. It's proven at scale. It's obviously incredibly universal across the pharmaceutical industry. So for example, cell therapies, antibodies, the production of vaccines, this is essentially often using microorganisms or using fermentation in very, very, very large steel tanks and building an efficient bioprocess around that. It's relatively low cost. It's familiar to the food industry I mentioned. Rapid R&D compared to plants, animals, or even animal cell culture. So there's a massive advantage there. And there's the opportunity for really rapid production. And so that's how you can get to a point where you could be producing a cow's worth of protein every 2 minutes. In terms of the major research areas to target to actually kind of work on fermentation, make these products better, make the technology better, these are, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are an example of some of the things that would be really helpful to have more scientists, more startups, more people actually working on. Target identification, so that's target in the context of precision fermentation is the thing you're choosing to make. So that might be producing whey protein so that you could then make cheese downstream of that, or casein, for example. Strain development, the vast majority of the pharmaceutical, the food industry relies on a very small number of what are called workhorse strains. So a small number of microorganisms which are used and which are familiar and which regulators understand, and there's lots of safety data behind them. It's incredibly limiting to do that, and there's a lot of work that could be done to either better optimize the strains that are already used so that they're being optimized for alternative protein applications, or to go out there and actually explore the other microorganisms that exist, and that's just this incredibly untapped space. Feedstock optimization. So feedstock refers to the food that you feed the microorganism. So microorganisms can be incredibly flexible in what they're willing to eat, which is a huge advantage. So for example, you could provide, if you're trying to produce a source of protein, can you just use carbon dioxide as the carbon source, as the food for that microorganism, which would obviously be an incredibly cool thing in that it would be a carbon negative production process overall. You also might be able to essentially upcycle waste side streams from other industries. So for example, if you have a bunch of corn husks or a bunch of cauliflower leaves lying around in a field because they tend to be wasted, that's a valuable source of carbon and a valuable source of nitrogen. Could you be using that as a food source for your fermentation process? Again, so you have this very circular process, which essentially just maximizes the ability to make this a really, really sustainable thing. Process design and manufacturing, I won't go into. Formulation and product development, ultimately this is food, and it's really important that it tastes good. And so these are all ways to make the process really efficient and bring down the costs, but it really matters that it tastes good and that you have good food scientists and product developments and chefs all working to actually make that happen. And then finally, if we go into cultivated, again, I gave a very brief overview of that before, but just to kind of visualize that a little bit. So back to what I said about taking a small sample of cells from an animal, then you are growing them in this bioreactor or this cultivator. You then trigger a change in conditions, which essentially persuades the cells to start to differentiate or transition into the cell types which are relevant for meat. So fat, muscle, connective tissue are the major cell types for that. And then ultimately you're harvesting those cells and then formulating them into final products. The final thing I should say on this slide, when the cells are growing in a bioreactor, they're growing in something which is called cell culture media. That's essentially the liquid that the cells are growing in, and it's kind of performing equivalent role to what the blood would do in a body. It's bringing the nutrients, the glucose, the amino acids, the various different signaling molecules, and it's removing the waste products, carbon dioxide, lactate, etc. The vast majority of the world's cell culture media was developed for medical professionals and scientists working in labs, which means it's extraordinarily expensive, and it cannot be so when you're trying to produce food. So that's a major, major issue, is bringing down the cost of that cell culture media. If we look briefly at how the cultivated meat sector has developed over the past decade, so there have been some kind of small research projects and kind of flittering of activity before 2013, but 2013 was the year where the world kind of believed that cultivated meat might actually be possible. And the thing that triggered that was a professor in the Netherlands called Professor Mark Post, developing in his lab, in his academic lab at Maastricht University, growing muscle constructs and then ultimately formulating those into a burger. That burger was actually brought to London and cooked and served by a chef, and people ate it. That burger cost $330,000 to produce. So it was a proof of concept that said to the world, this is possible, but it was very obviously pointing at the fact that if this was ever going to be a viable displacement for animal protein, then there would have to be a lot of R&D that would happen in the interim. And that's kind of what we've seen happening over the decades since. So from kind of 2013 to 2019, we had kind of a flurry of startups moving into the space and working on it and looking at potentially developing cultivated meat. And then in 2019, we started seeing the more kind of essentially the better funded or the more successful of these startups actually working to producing at the pilot scale. So that's out of the lab into a kind of small production facility. 2022 onwards, we saw, again, a small handful of companies moving to the demonstration scale. This is where they're producing the kind of on the order of thousands of metric tons per year. And then there's a question mark here because we don't know essentially at what point any number of these companies are going to start producing at the industrial scale. So that's producing at the scale of millions of metric tons per year. Yeah, I will leave that there. Essentially, all aspects of that process need to be worked on. As said, it's only really a decade that people have been working on this, so it's not surprising that every component is far from optimized. Cell lines, so that's taking the cells from the animal and then developing viable cell line banks that you can keep going back to rather than going back to the animal. That's a research priority. I mentioned cell culture media. That is probably the biggest research priority. Over 80% of the total cost of producing cultivated meat comes down to the cost of that liquid that the cells are grown in. Scaffolding, again, for the kind of biochemists or cell biologists amongst you, mammalian cells and fish cells tend to be adherent, which means that they want to grow attached to something. One way you can do that is scaffolding technology. So essentially having little balls essentially floating around that the cells can attach to. It has the advantage of supporting cell growth. It also has the advantage that it can provide a 3D structure and a texture, so that final meat product. So if you have an edible scaffold, you can layer the scaffold in such a way that you're kind of essentially telling the cells how to layer themselves such that you're starting to produce things like whole cuts, like chicken breasts or steaks. And then the bioprocess, that's essentially all of the kind of chemical engineers coming together and building a really efficient process, efficient tanks that these cells are growing in, things like recycling technologies, ways to reduce energy consumption, things like that. The Good Food Institute commissioned an organization to essentially do a techno-economic assessment of cultivated meat production. A techno-economic assessment is essentially modeling the production process and trying to identify what are the major cost drivers of producing the final product. And as I mentioned before, that essentially all came down to the cost of that cell culture media. So there's a bunch of different research approaches that could be taken to try to address that. Metabolic engineering, so you could work with the cells such that they just require less cell culture media. You could reduce the cost of cell culture media directly, so you could be sourcing those ingredients from cheaper sources. It doesn't need to be pharmaceutical grade. Can you use things like chickpea hydrolysates or other crop sources rather than incredibly over-engineered, incredibly expensive pharmaceutical components? Find ways to recycle the cell culture media in that bioprocess. And then the final cost driver is just find a way to actually finance the ability to do this research as you increase the scale of production. Things cost a lot of money if you're in a lab and you're trialing and erroring across different conditions. If you're doing that at kind of millions of liters of scale, The costs are pretty out of this world, and most of the companies doing this are startups, and they just don't have the financing to actually do that kind of R&D. Okay, so how can you get involved in the sector if you find it interesting, if you find it exciting, or you think it's just a really important thing and you want to support it in some way? I've covered some of these already, but this is just to kind of reiterate that opportunities, if you're a scientist, really do exist across the entire ecosystem. You don't have to be interested in all three of these pillars. You don't have to be interested in just one of these pillars. If one of these scientific problems is something that you find interesting, then you definitely have something really important to contribute to the alternative protein sector. You don't also have to be a scientist. Opportunities exist in the research field, but they also exist across many other sectors. So obviously academia, if you're doing that research, we heard before about the importance of courses, and there's going to be a really important role for universities in actually educating that future workforce for the alternative protein sector. Industry, if you're at all commercially minded, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're someone who wants to do marketing or communications or HR or any of the myriad roles that are really important in a company, those will be roles which are going to just be exploding in the alternative protein sector over the coming years. Government has an incredibly important role of policy in actually supporting this space. So that could be in bringing more research funding into the space. That could be in supporting a fair and transparent regulatory path to market for these products. Also things like labeling laws. I'm not sure how well known it is, but essentially a bunch of kind of big agriculture farming groups in the form of various different lobbies in Europe a couple of years ago tried to bring in EU legislation that would ban alternative protein products using words like burger or sausage, and instead they would have to use words like disc or stick, which are obviously not super appetizing, and it's incredibly unhelpful for an industry which is trying to be familiar and accessible to consumers and make that barrier to transition as attrition-free as possible. And there's just a huge role in government in making sure that there is an enabling policy environment to actually support the sector as it grows. And actually in the UK, I will say that things have been developing really positively there. I obviously come to you from a non-profit organisation. There are a bunch of different non-profits in the space who are doing lots of interesting work to try and support the sector. So that's also an option if you were looking to build a career in this space. If you are a scientist and you want to be using your science in the alternative protein sector, this list could basically be endless. If you have any kind of background in science, because the research challenges in alternative proteins are just so interdisciplinary, you probably have something useful to contribute somewhere. But this is just essentially just to give an example of some of the kinds of disciplines which are useful for which alternative protein pillar. And yeah, very happy to talk more about that if people have questions. I already mentioned the importance of kind of commercial innovation in this space. If you are someone with a scientific background and you're at all commercially minded, I genuinely believe that this is the most exciting sector that you could be in. And I kind of see it as kind of equivalent to if you were kind of in IT or like a software engineer in the 90s and the dot-com boom was happening. This to me is what is happening right now in synthetic biology and alternative proteins. It's so new, there's so much low-hanging fruit that you just have the ability, if you're coming in, to immediately be contributing really useful and exciting things. Just to give an example of this, a few students at Imperial a few years ago won some kind of internal entrepreneurship competition just within the university. They were actually trying to work on that cell culture media challenge that I was speaking about before. And they've now fundraised many, many millions of dollars and are a viable company and are out there producing cell culture media for the sector. And they were mostly undergraduates, I think. So you really can contribute a lot very quickly in a space where there's just, it's not saturated, it's not crowded. There's a lot of things that you could be doing straight away. Oh, this one, the formatting has got slightly funny. I kind of touched on this already, but this is again just to like get the kind of brain juices flowing around all of the kinds of things that will be important and useful for alternative proteins if you're not a scientist. Environmental scientists, nutrition, obviously, consumer science, I've mentioned policy. There's a whole load of commercial things that aren't just for those working in an alternative protein company, but things around like supply chain and investment and financing. And it's kind of like food is this incredibly large, important thing that has massive knock-on effects in our global economy. And as that's kind of, as the kind of food kind of ecosystem changes around the world, it's just going to have knock-on effects on everything. And all of these different other kinds of work can contribute and support that to make sure that it's as useful and that the transition is as sustainable and actually good as it can be. I want to talk a little bit about the Alternative Protein Project. You've heard a little bit already, but essentially universities are one of the most important entities when you have a technology-driven transition happening in any sector. Universities do research, they do teaching, they spin out companies and produce innovation, and they just generally get people excited about what's happening. So given you are based at a university, there's just so much you can already be doing to support the alternative protein space. That's basically the motivation for why GFI launched the Alt Protein Project initiative. So the Alt Protein Project is essentially a collection of student-led societies around the world that are working to support alternative proteins from within their institution, around things like education, research, innovation, just generally building a community and helping people who are interested in the space talk to one another and have a space where like-minded individuals can actually hang out, and also building awareness. As of 2023, these are the current alt protein projects that we have globally. 17 of them are in Europe. In the UK, we have, let's see if I can remember, UCL, Imperial, Warwick, Oxford, Cambridge. I think that's right for the UK. And then 12 more across Europe, and then obviously many across the rest of the world as well. So if you were to get involved in the UCL Alt Protein Project, you would be part of the UCL Alt Protein Project, but you would also be part of this global network of student groups around the world who are working to build excitement about alternative proteins from within their institutions. Here are just essentially some examples of what alt protein projects have been able to do so far. So the scheme has been running for about 3 years now. I won't go through all of these, but this is quite a cool one here. So the Illinois and the US Alt Protein Project co-president received $10,000 to pilot a cultivated meat research project from within their institution. So there's definitely real things that you can do right now from within a university which are genuinely and meaningfully contributing to the alternative protein space. And then finally, for those who are excited about alternative proteins, and hopefully I've persuaded at least some of you, we at the Good Food Institute have developed a bunch of resources to support you as you look at what it could look like for you to actually move into the space. If you are a scientist or you want to stay in academia, we have a bunch of research ideas. I've discussed some of them today, but this is essentially a wish list of some of the major research priorities in alternative proteins. If you want to collaborate with a company as part of that work, if you want to work for a company as part of your career, we have a database of alternative protein companies around the world. And if you are looking to work with scientists or collaborate with other scientists, you can look through the Alternative Proteins Researcher Directory, which is essentially a list of scientists working in alternative proteins. Those could be potential supervisors or potential collaborators. If you want to essentially listen to talks and kind of hear from others who are already in the space, you can join our GF Ideas community. There's essentially 2 tracks to that, a science track and a business track. So you can pick which track you're more interested in, or you can say both. And we have themed talks from different speakers coming to talk about what it is that they're up to. If you are a scientist, GFI ourselves do actually fund research. So we have an annual research grant program. So that could be, for example, for you directly, or if you have a supervisor or something and you want to do a project in the space and want to convince them to host you in their lab, there is funding available for them to do that. So definitely check that out if that's potentially of interest. If you want to learn more about the science of alternative proteins, we have a free online course that essentially takes you through self-paced modules where you can just learn the basics of alternative proteins and just go more deeply into some of the things I've ran through today. Or you can actually look at our course database where you can see which courses around the world already include content on alternative proteins as part of what they're doing. hopefully UCL will be a member of that course if Petra and Michael are able to make the case to the university. We have a newcomer's resource guide. So this is essentially a document that just gives you basically kind of takes your hand and kind of takes you by the hand and walks you through what the next steps might look like if you want to move into the space. And if you are entrepreneurial, we have a dedicated kind of manual to support you if you want to start an alternative proteins company. If you're looking for jobs in the space, we have a careers portal. So you can just go there and there are open jobs from across the sector and you can filter by things, by location and things like that. And as mentioned, we do, it's actually on the previous slide, but we have a company database. You can just look through that to see if there's any companies you're interested in, and you can kind of contact them directly to see if you might be interested in working there. There are some other helpful resources for how to think about your career if you're interested in the question of intensive animal agriculture. 80,000 hours, I would always recommend. There's a really good resource. There's also a dedicated organization called Animal Advocacy Careers. So that's also a place to go if you're looking for ways in which you could shape your career to support this particular issue, whether that's around alternative proteins or other kinds of career. And with that, I think I'm going to leave it there and say, go to our website to find all of those things and probably many other things that I forgot to mention. And thank you for coming and listening. So we're going to